Morning. On the way into town today, the kids were talking about, well, are you nervous? Why would you be nervous? You do this all the time. I'm glad that they think I preach all the time. I think what they meant is I speak in front of people all the time. So to take the edge off my nerves and make me feel a little more comfortable, it will help me if you slouch, sigh, roll your eyes, throw an occasional paper airplane. I'm not looking at anyone specifically. And maybe even look at me once in a while like this. So some of you are already doing those things. It's helping. Earlier this week, when the boys were wondering why I was, well, actually just one of them was wondering what I was doing on my laptop and sitting at the table, and I said that I was going to be speaking on Sunday. And he thought that was interesting. And I'm going to have a little time of confession here. We let our kids bring books to church, and they're allowed to read. And then Carter had said to me, "Mom, I'm not even going to read unless I think you're boring." So if Carter pulls out his book, I know it's time for me to bring it up a notch. Mitch also told me this morning that because I tend to rabbit trail, that perhaps we should have looked into a shock collar, and then he could have shocked me every time I need to refocus. I am not wearing a shock collar. Those are my confessions. My other confession is that I can't stand in front of you today and share anything deep and profound. So if that's what you were hoping for, I'm not offended if you stand up and leave. That's not what I can do. But I can share with you a glimpse of what I'm learning and of what God is teaching me. And I use intentionally the present tense there because I have not learned these things. I am learning them. So if I get things wrong this morning, please be gracious. What I share comes from a place of honesty. I hope from a place of humility, a sense of inadequacy, because I don't have this stuff figured out. But I think I'm not alone in that. James already set me up so well for this crisis, seasons of crisis. I remember once being in a hospital bed, I think it was after my snowmobile accident, and my dad said, these things build character. And I said, don't I have enough character? Ugh. But I've heard it said that seasons of chaos or crisis will reveal our true character. I hope that's not always true, because sometimes when we are running late to get to school, it feels like a moment of crisis. And if what comes out of me is my true character, Lord help me, right? And my kids can vouch for that. It's not my shining moment when we're running late for school. And I hope that's not my true character. And I think if we think about crisis or chaos, we can all agree that at some point in the last 2 years, each of us has come to a place of crisis or chaos, whether that's been linked to what we have been going through collectively or not, or something individually. We have all walked through a time of crisis or chaos. And in the thick of it, I hope that my character has been consistent with the faith that I claim to build my life on. And I hope that my character points to Jesus. The word crisis seems to, in a lot of ways, describe well where I'm at. I've hit a season of a crisis of faith of sorts. And don't misunderstand me, or don't get worried or anything. I have not abandoned my faith. I haven't questioned who God is or what Jesus has done for us. It's actually the opposite. As I've wrestled through my faith, I've experienced more deeply the love of Jesus. And in that love, I've started asking myself questions about how I live and how I love others. And I've grappled and really struggled with, what does it mean for me to love Jesus in a world where that doesn't make sense to with so many things, in the world and the culture that we find ourselves in. And then I think of how exercising stretches our muscles, and it's painful, and it makes me sore. But then it produces a strength that I wasn't quite expecting. So I'm in a place of exercising that faith I have in God, and trusting that his promises are true. I'm wrestling with what I've known my whole life and trying to reconcile it with the world that is more broken, more deeply broken and hurting in ways that I can't fully understand. And I know I'm not alone in this. I know I'm not alone in this room, but I also know as I read scripture that I'm not alone in this. Because if there's anything that we can learn from the life of Jacob, from Israel himself, it's that we can wrestle. Jacob wrestled with God, so maybe I can wrestle in my faith. Maybe I can ask hard questions. And Jacob refused to give up in the wrestling until Yahweh blessed him. So I think we can wrestle until we come to that side of blessing. But in that wrestling, we need to know we don't leave unchanged. We don't leave unscathed. Likely, we're going to come away with a limp, but there's beauty in that. I really believe there's beauty in that, because that limp testifies to God's strength, but also his faithful presence in our lives. So I say it in the best way possible. I'm in a season of chaos, and that chaos changes. All of that to say my students are right when they say I ramble, because that's not even what I'm talking about today. But I'm nervous, and I'm wrestling, and I hope that you can engage a little bit in that wrestle with me this morning. So we have that cleared up. I'm going to clear up another area of historical confusion. It hasn't been very confusing in these walls, but in other areas of my life, it has been confusing. I am not Geraldine, nor am I Hertha Penner's daughter. This has, again, it's not as confusing anymore because Geraldine doesn't live here, but it's been such an area of confusion in my past that there were times in my life where I actually just didn't correct people. Yeah, my mom did just move to town. Yeah, she's doing great, right? Or one time, a clerk at co-op, this was in high school, called me back and was like, Geraldine, and I'm like, she's not here. So yes, you left your debit card. Oh, did I? I will take that. And there were times when even Geraldine and I got confused, and we were told once, and we were like preteens. We were told that actually we really looked like each other from like the eyes down. So like our nose and our mouth. And we were like, that's interesting. Let's test this theory. So we were at my grandparents', we're in the basement, and we're like, okay, let's cover our eyes and look in the mirror and see if it's true. Hey, Jer? Yeah, I get it. So, and again, we were older than we should have been to try that experiment. But I know that our parents have even had to take a second look at pictures before to like, okay, who exactly is that? And when Ethan had just started walking, Geraldine was visiting here, and I was talking to somebody else, and he went up to Geraldine and, Mommy, up. She just picked him up, held him for a while, and then it took a couple minutes and he pushed back. I was like, you are not my mom. So I actually love it when people say I remind them of someone. It gives a sense of belonging. And I love it when people say like, oh, Carter reminds me so much of like your dad or your brother when they were younger. And when people say that, Ethan reminds that like his antics remind them of me. And there are things about them that remind people of Mitch as well, but it gives a sense of belonging, right? And a sense of identity. Genetic resemblances are fascinating. I find them very interesting. And like, if it's a great resemblance, that's a positive thing. But it's even better if I remind someone of somebody else who is kind, somebody else who is loving, somebody else who is compassionate. So if I take the vanity out of it and step back from it a little bit, who do I want to look like? Who do I want to remind people of? Ideally, Jesus. I might look like certain members of my family, might have mannerisms that remind people of somebody else, but I want my character to look like Christ's. So think about your life and who you are. What characteristics do you have that point to Jesus, that mirror Jesus? There are a lot that we could talk about, but I want to focus specifically on the characteristic of compassion. God is a God of compassion, and we see this lived out in the life of Jesus, and that's where we're going to focus today, on the life of Jesus and how he was a living example of compassion. If you were to look compassion up in a dictionary, it's a noun. So we have like concrete nouns and abstract nouns. An abstract noun is just an idea or a feeling. So compassion is an abstract noun. It's an idea or a feeling. It's defined as sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings or misfortunes of others. So it's recognizing that other people are suffering. But when we look to Jesus, God made flesh, Jesus, the living word, we see that compassion is more than sympathy and it's more than pity. Those are feelings. They're abstract, and usually feelings are things that we can acknowledge, like I'm feeling nervous, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling happy. They're things that we can acknowledge and maybe even sometimes walk away from or push ourselves through. But compassion in the truest form, when viewed through the life and example of Jesus, becomes a verb because it propels action. The Bible says often in the Gospels, like in Matthew 9, verse 36, and Mark 6, verse 34, Jesus comes upon a crowd of people and he has compassion for them because they are like sheep without a shepherd. And then we read further into the miracles of Jesus. So the Bible doesn't say he was moved to compassion, so he took a big breath and carried on. That would be a very different gospel message. It propelled him to action. Before feeding the 5,000, in Mark 6, verse 34, it says he was moved by compassion. Before healing the blind, in Matthew 20, verse 34, he was moved with compassion. Before raising Lazarus from the dead, in John 11, verse 35, it says he was deeply moved with compassion. Compassion and then moved. Not compassion and went on. He felt compassion and he was moved to do something about it. The miracles he performed are astounding. But also is the truth that these miracles were not just preordained things that Jesus did, but these miracles were preceded by compassion. It's not just like, oh, I'm doing a miracle today. That's what I got on my memo to-do list. I got to do a miracle. No, they were born out of compassion. In the life of Jesus, compassion is lived out as a tangible expression of love for those who are suffering. Often through a miracle, but not always. Sometimes just through a conversation, maybe by a well. An acknowledgement of somebody's existence, maybe by saying their name. They're acknowledging their pain or their worship, their offering of 2 coins. He acknowledged. Also, in the life of Jesus, we find that compassion, when lived out, is almost always inconvenient, and it's almost always countercultural. So again, we're focusing on the example of Jesus, which is the most accurate example we have of the living characteristics of God. So we see how compassion is rarely well-timed or convenient. And Many of us who have spent any amount of time with children know that the needs of children are rarely convenient. Often I'm in the bathroom and there's a knock on the door, "Mom, I need." Great. Or when you have a newborn and they're hungry in the middle of the night, that's not convenient. Often what people need from us is not convenient. Jesus was never like, okay, so I checked my agenda and I have a block of space from 4 to 6 p.m. where maybe I could exercise some compassion. So if you have a need, hit me up then. It's not how he operated. Usually he was teaching, and maybe a man was lowered through the roof. Or maybe he was walking down the road and came across a leper. Or maybe he was trying to recline after a meal and being with crowds of people and being touched all the time, and he is worshiped through perfume on his feet. Or sometimes even trying to find some peace and quiet and take a nap, and people need him. It's storming out. We could use your help, Jesus. Inconvenient. He didn't time those things out. He didn't keep office hours. These things just happened as he went about his life and about his day. So if we look to Jesus' compassionate interactions with others, we see the inconvenience, but we also see how his interactions challenge some pretty serious social norms. I've lived most of my life in small town Killarney, Manitoba, and growing up, I'm going to use the term cultural norms, so to speak, they weren't stretched very often simply because they didn't need to be in my day-to-day life. And as parents, we create the culture of our home, and we kind of set for our children what they will then determine is comfortable or okay. We give them kind of those boundaries that they grow up in and that they live with. And as we grow up, as we all grow up, we grow in that and they're stretched a little bit and we realize, okay, this is how we grew up and this is how I'm being stretched. I remember doing inner street ministry as a youth event, and this was in Calgary. So inner street Calgary, or inner city Calgary, the people that we saw when we got there, I'm like, these are all people I am supposed to, like, stranger danger, stay away from, do not interact with, don't make eye contact, right? But we had sandwiches and bottles of water, and we were supposed to interact with these people, share a meal with them, and then offer to pray with them. So all of my this is not my normal, right? I'm feeling very stretched. And I remember we were always with another person. I was with somebody and we were sharing this food with a man who spoke French but had broken English. And he asked us to pray with him. So we prayed with him, and after he took my head in his hands and kissed me on the forehead, I was like, whew, it's all kinds of uncomfortable there, right? Whew. And then another time, I think within the same year, I went to Mexico with a group from the churches here in Killarney, and I got my Twin Ricks shots, cornrowed my hair so that, less likely to bring home lice, was given instructions on how to keep my suitcase in the hotel so that I wouldn't bring home cockroaches, and sent with an ample supply of hand sanitizer and instructions not to eat produce from the street, like from street vendors, not to drink water unless it was from a bottle, and under no circumstances should you have dairy products off the street, okay? Some of this came from the leaders, some of it came from my parents, and that's fair. So I remember we were walking through the streets in Mexico and we were invited into this house, and these houses are more like tents, and this woman was so excited to have us in her home, and it was just a couple of us. We were in her home, and sit, she wanted us to sit, and then she brought out this cake, and right away I'm like, oh no, and then she says, it's goat milk cake. I've got all these warning bells in my head. Do not, whatever you do not eat the dairy. So my cultural norms are being stretched, but in that moment, I recognize that as her 2 coins, her offering of 2 coins. And I figured, maybe I'll have an upset stomach, but I'm going to eat this cake. And I did, and I didn't get an upset stomach then. So those are maybe not the best examples, but they're the only examples I have from my life where it's like what I knew and what I was comfortable with was being stretched. Jesus was all about stretching these ideas of normal and comfortable, and he came under some pretty hard judgment for his approach to what culture told people was acceptable. Consider how the Pharisees and the teachers of the law viewed his miracles, right? We got to think closely about who he was healing, typically outcasts, and when he was healing, often on the Sabbath. Both were very unconventional. We read these stories knowing that Jesus was fully God and fully man. We approach these stories already knowing the outcome. It's like, oh yeah, he's going to heal on the Sabbath, but that man's going to walk. Like, that's cool. We know that. We come to these stories with that knowledge. The religious leaders of Jesus' time did not know this. And if they had an inkling, it was kind of silenced. All they heard was a teacher who had become popular and was contradicting the law, saying things like, you have heard it said, but I say to you. Like, for the religious leaders, there's all sorts of warning bells when Jesus is teaching. And we can't fault them totally for that because they were trying to uphold the Torah, the law given by Yahweh to Moses. They were trying to uphold that. In Matthew chapter 8, there's a man with leprosy asking Jesus for healing. And in verse 3, it says, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. In Mark 5, verse 21, we have two stories happening at once. I'm actually going to read that passage. So if you want to turn in your Bibles with me to Mark chapter 5, verse 21, I'm going to start reading there. So Mark chapter 5, verse 21, and I'm going to read to the end of verse 42. So buckle in. When Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. So again, we see Jesus with a large crowd. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, "My daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so I know she can get well and live." So Jesus went with him, and the large crowd followed him and was pressing against him. Now, a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under the doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not being helped at all. On the contrary, she was becoming worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothes. For she said, if I just touch his clothes, I will be made well. Okay, I'm just going to stop there for a minute. I do this all the time. Sorry, guys. Bear with me. Okay, so let's just put ourselves in that context here. The crowds are probably, there's probably men and women, but this woman is alone. She doesn't have a man with her, okay? And she would be considered ceremonially unclean. And she has been unclean for decades, which means at that time, she has been unable to engage and interact with society like most people would be able to. She has not been able to participate in temple worship for a very long time. And she's approaching out of desperation, and probably, I envision it that she's trying to be very subtle because this is shameful. What she's dealing with is shameful. So she's trying to be very subtle and trying to be discreet. If I just touch him, I'll be healed, and then I can walk away. So just try to put yourself in that context. If I just touch his clothes, I will be made well. And instantly the flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. At once Jesus realized in himself that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched me?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you can say, 'Who touched you?'" But Jesus was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. "Daughter," he said, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." When Jesus overheard what was said, he told the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid, only believe." He didn't let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James' brother. They came to the leader's house, and he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, but he put them all outside. He took the child's father, mother, and those who were with him, and entered the place where the child was. Again, we're going to stop there. Think of the context. This is a dead body, ceremonially unclean, a dead body. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koan," which is translated, "Little girl, get up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. At this, they were utterly astounded, and he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Okay, let's recap. Jairus comes. He needs Jesus to heal his daughter. It's kind of inconvenient. Jesus was teaching to these crowds, and somebody is sick and dying. Hang tight, I'll be right back kind of thing. So Jesus agrees to come. While he's on his way, a woman who has been bleeding for years reaches out in desperation and touches Jesus. This happens, and then they find out that actually the little girl died, and Jesus is like, "No, don't worry about it." And he goes and he touches her, and she comes back to life. In this story, like the story of the man with leprosy, yes, Jesus heals and restores, but he touches them. These people, according to Torah, were unclean, and anyone who touched them was then, by association, unclean. The leper, the bleeding woman, unclean and social outcasts. Jesus saw them. He felt compassion for them, and he touched them. And in doing so, completely reorganizes the law. He showed us what it is to be moved by our compassion, even when it doesn't make sense. His compassion moved him to action, and his actions caused him to break more social norms than we can possibly imagine. In John chapter 9, Jesus heals a man who was born blind. That's great. But to do this, he spits on the ground, not COVID safe, makes mud and rubs it on the guy's eyes and is like, "Hey, go wash in Siloam." If that's not unconventional, I don't know what is, and that really puts me eating a goat milk cake into perspective. In John 8, verse 1 to 11, a woman is caught in adultery. The Pharisees and teachers of the law want to see what Jesus is going to do about it. They want to see if he will, in this situation, because adultery is serious, if he's going to finally follow the law. And Jesus doesn't. And his response breaks every rule and probably causes the religious leaders to experience a serious increase in blood pressure and like red flags and alarm bells happening for these religious leaders, right? In front of the Pharisees and teachers, we read that Jesus gets down on the ground and starts writing. We know that part of the story. But he gets down on the ground. This woman is crouched on the ground, probably in self-defense. He gets down on the ground. Doesn't matter what he's writing, he's on the ground at her level. And he restores dignity to a broken woman. And again, reorganizes the law. His compassion propels action. He gets to her level, he stoops down, he sees her, and he lifts her up. John chapter 4, Jesus talks to a Samaritan woman, and this conversation there too breaks all the social norms of the time, and Brian talked about that a couple weeks ago. So if you want to hear about that conversation, go check out Brian's message 2 or 3 weeks ago. We could go on and on with these examples too, like Zacchaeus, right? The centurion's servant, situations where Jesus broke convention and his compassion moved him to action. If this is going to be a characteristic we want to embody, we can't draw lines. Jesus didn't draw lines. Who was, you qualify for healing, but you don't. You qualify for my time, but you don't. Jesus didn't do that. Jesus' compassion is hitting me hard. How many times did he work against the grain of culture? How many times did he advocate for the social underdog? Like the people that, right? How many times did he come under the scrutiny of religious leaders, and such serious scrutiny that they denied that he was God's son and tried to, killed him? As I consider Jesus' character, I am so challenged. My eyes have been opened a little bit. I'm sure there's more opening that can be done, but my eyes have been opened to injustice on so many levels, not all over the world, but not just in the far corners, right around us too. And yeah, we can't solve every problem. I know that. We can't solve every problem, but we can meet those around us where they are. We can take time to see people, to get to their level, maybe even to restore some dignity. In the life of Jesus, we see people who are unclean being touched, people who are marginalized are spoken to, people who are misunderstood are given a little space to be heard, and those who are outcasts are given a seat at the table. Romans 5 verse 8 says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. In his compassion, he met people where they were at, and he meets us where we are at. He has met me where I'm at. And in my brokenness, and there are moments of brokenness, he has wrapped me in loving compassion. And he's wrapped me in that compassion before the action of change. First comes compassion. And as I experience his compassion, I experience him moving and changing things in my life. I have to think too, that if he has met me and extended compassion to me, the songs that we sing, the words that we sing on Sundays or in our kitchens are just as much for the dirtiest of sinners as they are for the holiest of saints. The promises in Scripture are just as much for me in my brokenness and in my shame as they are for anyone else. There is nowhere where God won't go, and he enters where we are. And we're at different places, all of us. And sometimes the hardest thing to do is extend kindness, gentleness, love, to be compassionate for those who we believe are profoundly wrong, politically, theologically. I recently read, I want to practice the ways of Jesus over and over until the scales fall from my eyes and my ears will hear. I love that, especially the word practice, because it gives us that space to miss the mark. And we're going to miss the mark. But when we fail, when we miss the mark, we fall into grace. And we need to, if we are going to live in compassion to others, give them grace to fall into. And in compassion, maybe we can meet them where they're at and try to understand something that we don't understand. Can we view those around us through this inconvenient and socially challenging lens of compassion? And if we are going to be people of compassion, we need to be known for having hands that love and not fingers that point, mouths that speak truth and not tongues that accuse. Of course, We can't do this in our own strength. We're actually, as humans, not very good at this. But Hebrews 12, verse 2 says we can fix our eyes on Jesus, who is the author and the perfecter of our faith. So as we do this, as we experience his compassion, and as we fix our eyes on Jesus, hopefully when people see us, they won't just say, oh, you remind me of your cousin, or oh, you look like so-and-so. Hopefully our character points to Christ. More than a genetic resemblance, maybe they'll see a resemblance to Jesus. So the challenge I am experiencing, and I invite you to experience with me, is to let God be the God of our chaos and our wrestling, and to let him be the God of compassion in our lives so that we can extend that compassion and action to the lives of others. And I pray that it will all be for his glory.